Well, thanks for coming and joining me here this afternoon. We'll talk a little bit about reviewing architectures. This is kind of a primary job responsibility for those of us with the magical architecture title. I talked about some of this yesterday, but the longer I spend in this role as an architect, the more sure I am of the fact that our central job title really boils down to education. Our job is to educate. Our job is to communicate. Push comes to shove, if we can't effectively communicate, if I can't effectively tell my developers, the rest of my staff, what it is we're trying to do, I can't tell the story. If I can't tell the story, I can't be an effective architect. There's just no getting around that. Now, one of the most important steps in telling the story well is being able to critique the story. And there's two sides of that coin. One is being able to critique someone else's work in a constructive manner, as opposed to just saying, well, this is crap. The other side of it, though, is being able to accept that criticism. And that's hard. There's no getting around that. I remember the first time I threw one of my architectures into the mix, there was a little bit of nervousness as my team started tearing it apart. And you go, okay, well, it's not about me. It's about making a better architecture. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is telling the story well, telling it effectively. And so we have to be able to accept that part of that is going to be, how could I tell it better? What do we need to do to make that more effective? So that's really what I want to try to talk about here this afternoon. Now, there's a bunch of different types of reviews. I'm going to go through some that I've been involved in. I'm sure you probably have experiences with different types as well. I'm curious to know what kind of stuff you guys have done. But there's a lot of different reasons why we would review an architecture. Some happen more frequently. There's no getting around that. Some happen at a pretty quick clip. Some are much more high ceremony kinds of things. And I'm not a huge fan of high ceremony, at least when we can possibly avoid it. Others are, quite frankly, informal. It can be as simple as, hey, do you have a few minutes to go over this diagram with me? Does it make sense? Is this clear? What do you think I'm trying to say when I put this out there? And then refining the message accordingly. Now, some of it is governance related. And I'm, in general, not a huge fan of governance, big G governance. It feels a little bureaucratic, and it feels like, we're sort of ordering people around. But there are some really good reasons to do that. One of the big things that we look at in my organization is, are we following the best practices and the standards that we want? Are we building this in a way that we're happy with, a sort of repeatable kind of manner we're trying to do? But another really important question here is, are we actually building the right thing? And that may seem like an obvious question. Well, of course we are, otherwise why would we be building it? But let's be honest, we've all been a part of a project where it's like, wait, how did this actually get to this point? How did no one stop this sooner? I've seen that way more often in my career than I'd like to admit. One of the things that's becoming increasingly important today is we have these existing capabilities. We have these web services that have been built across the organization. Can we leverage that? Do we really need to reinvent the wheel a fourth, a fifth, a sixth time? I had this conversation recently in my company where we were talking about a calendar widget. And someone told me that we had like 8 of them scattered throughout the company. I'm like, why would we have that? I mean, there's jQuery and there's other widgets we can just use. Why would we have written our own? Who let that happen? Now, I will admit that on the surface, a lot of these kinds of reviews seem very red tape-ish, very high ceremony, and a lot of people kind of resist, and it's like, ooh, we shouldn't do that. And honestly, they can be done very poorly. There's no getting around that. And they can simply be part of the process, something you check off a box, and they don't have a lot of value. But if you do it right, they can really serve the greater organization. One of the things I love about these kinds of reviews is they serve as an awesome educational opportunity. And I mean this in a bunch of different ways. I mean, at a minimum, it's a good way of socializing projects so people know what's going on. But here's the reality. None of us knows everything. Now, I know that may come as a shock to some of you, and I apologize for bursting any bubbles there. But here's the reality. More eyes is a good thing. The more people you get in front of it, the better off we're all going to be. I'm pretty much a front-end guy. That's kind of where I live. So I'm really not in a position to honestly critique which NoSQL database you chose to use. So if that's what you're looking for me to do, honestly, I'm just not going to be very helpful there. Now, if you want me to critique which JavaScript MV star library you want to use, now here we can have a really fun conversation. So from my standpoint, having different people involved helps you hit those different angles. And inevitably, on a big enough team, you're going to have someone who's like, you know what? I did a project like this 3 or 4 years ago. Here's something we ran into. Or, on the project I just completed, we had this problem. Go talk to Steve. He knows how to fix it. That's invaluable. I can't tell you how many times I've been in one of these reviews where someone says, nope, the person you need to talk to is so-and-so, and it saves you sometimes days and days of chasing people down and email chains and all that fun stuff because, hey, I've already been there. I already blew up that wall. Here's where the hole is. It can also serve as a really good sanity check. And there's a lot of times you get involved in a project, you get, down into the weeds, and you really get so focused in you can't see the bigger picture anymore. You're just so focused on kind of that day in, day out stuff, and having another person come in and say, you do realize that you should be using this service instead, right? This would be a better utilization of this, or we already built that, why are you building it again? Now, we all know it's a heck of a lot cheaper to find that out in the early stages of a project before we've cut thousands and thousands of lines of code, and now we have this inertia standing behind it. The other thing that's really useful here is socialization. My team, I think we've got about 40 architects spread across our company. And I don't know what they're all working on. There's no way I could know what they're all working on. But when I get pulled into reviews, it's a window into these other projects, and you can start asking other questions, and you can start following up with them about, hey, you know what? I helped with one of those projects a couple years ago. Keep me in the loop or let me know what's going on. Awareness here really is a good thing. There's no getting around it. Having other people know what's going on is incredibly useful when somebody moves on to a different project or when somebody needs to take a vacation or something like that. Now you've got a broader base of people who at least have an idea of what's going on. So if that project runs into trouble, well, the primary architect's on vacation, no problem, I've had some exposure. I can at least try to get you through the next week. Now, one thing that sometimes happens with these kinds of reviews is they turn into a blame fest. It becomes a lot of finger pointing. How dare you? Why did you do this? You're wrong, blah, blah, blah. And you gotta watch out for anything getting personal here. And sometimes it's human nature. Sometimes, we get a little argumentative. Maybe we didn't get enough sleep. Maybe we, spent too much time in the city center the night before, whatever it happens to be. You just can't go there. You can't get personal. It's gotta stay at the architecture level because it's all about improving the architecture. Now, the flip side of that is not taking the criticism personally. And this is hard. I've worked with some folks whose, quite frankly, their self-worth was very deeply tied up in their work. I experienced that with code more than anything else, and I actually worked at a company once where I was told that I couldn't use the term code smell because it offended some of the developers. I thought, really? I'm not calling them smelly. I'm not saying anything bad about them. I'm just saying the code could be better, but they were so wrapped up in this code is about me that they couldn't handle that. At the end of the day, the attitude you've always got to take into these meetings is, it's not about me, it's about the architecture. It's about making a better architecture, making a better product. I ran into this quote, and I thought it was really, really fitting. And it was talking about, how do we make these things great? And part of that is being honest enough with ourselves and saying, it's not perfect. It isn't great yet. What we're shooting for is the best solution here. Not necessarily where the idea comes from, and not sort of wrapping yourself up so personally, and understanding that the only way this is going to get better is by getting some more eyes on it and understanding that we can all improve. Now, if you're going to do these kinds of reviews, you need to make sure you've got adequate lead time. I've been involved in some of these where, in fact, this happened to me earlier this year. Someone sent out the documentation on Friday afternoon for a Monday morning meeting, and then was surprised when people hadn't reviewed it for the Monday morning meeting. It's like you sent it out at the end of the day on Friday, and it wasn't like it was a half-page summary kind of thing. This was a massive document full of all sorts of diagrams and discussions of ilities and which things were important and yada, yada, yada. And you just can't do that. You've got to give people at least a few days to look it over, if not a couple of weeks. Now, if you don't honestly have time to do the review, if you can't come to the meeting prepared, I'm of the opinion that you just shouldn't come then, because you're not going to help anything. You're just going to sit there and like, wait, what is this? Like, well, if you had read the material, you wouldn't have to ask that question. Now, if you can't make it, obviously apologize. Try to give people feedback if you can, but don't try to hold up the whole meeting for it. This becomes really problematic. Big believer in having somebody be a moderator. That shouldn't be the presenting architect. It should be somebody who's sort of a third-party objective outsider. And their job is simple, just keep things moving along. It is very easy in these kinds of reviews to go off into the weeds and just go on and on and on about little issues, and it can become a very dragged out process. So make sure you've got somebody that's, all right, can we table that conversation, or let's do that conversation offline. Their job also is to jot down any notes. If there's any kind of follow-up activity that needs to happen, if someone said, please add this diagram, their job is to make sure that it happens, make sure that anything that comes out of it gets circulated, not just to the folks who were there, but to anybody outside who is interested in the project. The really key metric here, though, is follow-up. If we're not going to do the follow-up, we lose a lot of value, frankly, in doing the review in the first place. Retrospectives are another opportunity for us to do a review. Now, retrospectives are hard because, let's be honest, we don't like to admit when we make mistakes. And that's a huge, important part of doing a retro, at least doing it well. And so a lot of folks are very resistant to the idea of ever even admitting we may not have done this perfectly. Or at least if they do it, they don't do it well. Now, I've been involved in a fair number of these over the years, and the absolute worst way to do it, as far as I'm concerned, is like to go around the room and ask everyone what went well on the project this iteration, what went poorly, what could we do better. I was on one project where the same stuff came up again and again and again, and we clearly weren't going to fix it. So it's like, why are we even going through this process? But I'm very much of the opinion this is an excellent thing for projects to do. It's a great idea to sort of reflect upon the iteration. What did we do well? How can we make it better? Please don't ask those questions. There's so many good ways to get that same information. But it does mean you have to be introspective. And that can be really hard for teams, to be able to look objectively at their work and find ways they could improve it. And I kind of like this idea, well, there were mistakes that were clearly made, but not by me, not with my stuff. It was somebody else's work. But it's also important to focus on positive things. We can't dwell just on the negative stuff, although we do want to make sure that we are honest about that, because the goal here is just to make it better. How do we improve? What do we need to change? Avoid blamestorming. This is kind of a constant refrain for me. These reviews become useless when it's just about assigning blame or trying to make someone feel bad for missing something. It's an opportunity for us to not just critique the architecture, but the process. Is there something we could do better here? Did we miss a requirement somewhere along the lines? My wife's a business analyst, so this is her world. And it's amazing how many times on projects, what it really boils down to is, we just didn't ask the right question at the right time. We didn't think about that use case. Okay, that's all right. As architects, one of the things we can look at and say, well, did we miss some important quality attribute here? One of the magic ilities. Is there something that we should have thought of, but we didn't? A lot of times we get really caught up in scale. Oh, this is going to scale. We're going to be the next Twitter. It's like, maybe. What are we at right now? Did we make some poor assumptions? That happens. There's no getting around that. We thought this was going to happen. We thought we were going to have this project to tie into, but it turns out that project was delayed. I had this happen to me. One of my projects had a dependency on this third-party product that our internal folks were bringing in. I was told when I started the project that it would be available the end of May. Now, this was in 2014. I said, yep, May 31st, it's going to be available. Awesome. I got an email the middle of this May saying it was available. So they were right. I got it at the end of May. They were just off by an entire calendar year. Now, that has a surprising ramification to my project, because without that product, my project doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't work. So that was one of those really interesting assumptions where we assumed, well, of course we'll have it by the end of May because we were assured we would, and a year later we finally got what they promised us. You gotta be really careful with assumptions. Whenever I do reviews, this is one of the big things that I always poke at. Well, we assume that this will be done in 6 months. We assume that this migration will happen in 2 weeks. What happens if you're wrong? What happens if we need to leave that infrastructure running for a year? What happens if it turns out we can't actually finish that in the time that you allocated? What happens if something else crops up, like the company buys another company and all work stops because we have to merge together? Now, one of the really important things we should be looking at in these situations is there something in the process that we need to change. This is one of the things that's really hard, because a lot of times these processes come out of good places. Something bad happened. Let's prevent this bad thing from happening again, so let's create a process to prevent it. And then they just ossify, and they just sit there, and 15 years later, people are like, why do we do this? Well, I don't know, that's the process. And they never bother to ask how to do it better. I'm actually trying to break one of our processes right now. The way we sort of evaluate software and bring it into the company takes forever, and it doesn't work in the current model where JavaScript libraries change every few days, and software, when was the last time Chrome updated? Probably 3 hours ago. We can't just pick a version and expect it's going to be the same version a year from now. But that challenges the process that was created 15, 20 years ago when software was a lot more like buying a couch. Like, we're going to have one, we don't need to worry about it for 5 or 10 years. I'm very much of the opinion we should always use these as opportunities to figure out, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? What do we need to do to make sure the future doesn't have this same problem? Do we need to do some education? Do we need to do some training? Is there some additional work that needs to happen here? But one of the most important things that should occur here is, let's get that out there. Let's socialize that. We've learned something here. Let's make sure that that knowledge gets out into the greater community instead of concentrated in 1 or 2 heads and then they forget about it. Please try to find the positives, though. And if something good did happen, find a way to bake that into your process. Process doesn't always have to be about negative stuff of preventing bad things from happening. It can also be about, hey, let's make sure we do that in the future. We did this technique and it worked really well for figuring out quality attributes. Let's see if we can get that baked into the process in some way, shape, or form. And do not be afraid to tweak. None of this is perfect. Fix it, try it again, see what happens. If it worked, great. If it didn't, fix it again, see what happens. Now, if you find yourself in these retros and the same things are coming up again and again and again, and I've experienced this firsthand, please fix it. It shouldn't keep coming up again and again. If it does, then let's all just be adults and admit we aren't actually going to solve this. For whatever reason, politically, technically, whatever, we're just going to have to live with it. And then let's put it to the side and let us not speak of it again. Another huge part of our job, frankly, is looking at vendor products and figuring out, does this fit in our environment? Where does it fit? How should we bring it in? We're not going to build every single chunk of code that we use. And I know some companies actually have a preference for purchasing, it's sort of buy, reuse, build, sort of the order of operations. So you're going to have to deal with vendor products. And a lot of our jobs as architects is to figure out, how do I evaluate that? How do I know whether this is a good or a bad product? How do I know whether this product is still going to be a good product in a couple of years? Since we obviously can't predict the future, that's a lot of fun. You're rarely going to get the source code. I mean, it depends on the product, depends on the vendor, but generally that's something they're not going to let you see. And so we have to move beyond the marketing material. A lot of folks, frankly, stop here. This is certainly where a lot of the VPs stop. The salesperson takes them out to a really nice lunch, promises a whole bunch of things, then all of a sudden, hey, guess what? We got the greatest thing since sliced bread here. Go use this product. And you have to understand and admit, marketing material is not truth. It is marketing. They're going to casually hide certain things from you and talk up things in other ways that may or may not be true. I'm very much of the opinion the only way you figure this stuff out is by actually working with the product, doing a proof of concept, getting in there and actually working with it. Otherwise, I just don't know how you figure this stuff out. Now, part of the challenge before you get into that, though, is figuring out, what do we need to test here? What is it we need to figure out? Right now, we're actually trying to make a decision around package managers for JavaScript, HTML, that kind of stuff. And so the first challenge for us was kind of figuring out, what criteria do we even want to evaluate here? We've got 3 or 4 different things to test, but what is it we actually want to compare them with? And so that's really been the last couple of weeks, is us just sort of debating what kinds of things, kind of use cases do we want to throw at this so we can actually evaluate them. So we try to figure out, what are the use cases we care about, what are the things that we think are important, what are the concerns we have about the product, and then how do we judge it? What's most important? A lot of times we use like Harvey balls. Those are those kind of different filled in circle, fully filled in says, yep, fully meets the criteria. Fully empty means it doesn't meet at all. Kind of gives you like a 1 through 5 kind of a thing. That's a reasonable way to do it, although you can certainly weight the criteria too if you're more interested in some things over others. One of the things that's really hard, though, is a lot of times we don't have enough resources, whether that's time or people, to do a really thorough test. And so we have to rely on kind of a hello world-like thing, and that may not be enough. So we have to figure out, with our limited amount of resources, what the heck are we going to do, and how do we feel good about that outcome at the end, that yes, we did test all the important stuff. Please do not rely on the vendor for this. I have seen situations where vendors bring in a pitch deck, they use that to talk about the value of the product, it's delivered by the vendor, and they're all just like, yep, that sounds great. It's like, wait, this is the vendor's material. The vendor is not going to come in and give you the unvarnished truth. So if you're going to take them at their face value, what's the purpose here? And please don't let them run the proof of concept, because then of course it's going to work. If they can't make a proof of concept work with their own stuff, I guess that makes our job easy, because you can just kind of draw a line through them. It's like, could not make their own product work. But a lot of our job is just identifying the risks of using these products and understanding not just the individual risks, but the impact and the likelihood. So you're inevitably going to run into situations where if this risk happens, this is going to have a massive, massive impact on the project. But is it likely or not? There are a lot of times where a more medium impact risk is a bigger deal to us because its likelihood is almost 100%. And I've been in lots of these situations where you have these big sort of, meteor hits the earth kind of risks, but they're also very unlikely, and they're not nearly as important in the overall evaluation as this seemingly unimportant thing, but we know that's going to happen. And so one of the risks I identified with the project I mentioned earlier was they won't deliver the product to me on time. And I figured that was a pretty likely outcome. Now, unfortunately for me, it also had a huge impact. So every so often you run into that wonderful scenario. Now, at the end of the day, our job often isn't to fix that, it's just to make people aware of it. Shed light on the risk so that other people can figure out what to actually do about it. Now, a lot of times this gets deeply, deeply into the politics of our job, and I hate that. I really do. I wish we could just focus on the technology, but that's just not the way it works. I did an evaluation of a product a few years ago where we identified all sorts of risks, and it didn't matter because the decision had essentially already been made. We were just there to do, due diligence isn't even the right word. I think it was just so somebody could say, well, we did an evaluation, which we subsequently ignored, but that's the way it works. There's a lot of stuff that gets chosen for what I can best describe as non-technical reasons. You can fill in your own blanks as to what some of those may be. A lot of times what it boils down to is you have somebody in your organization that's really, really excited about some analyst's sort of evaluation, and they say, oh, it's in the magic quadrant, ergo we must use it, and these other products aren't, even though they're better. You run into situations where somebody in the sort of purchasing hierarchy maybe used to work for the company, maybe they still have friends there, maybe they still have significant shares of stock in that company, and so they subtly recommend that. And the reality is we can't stop that. You just can't. It's just part of the job. It happens. Best you can do in those situations is try to insulate your projects from it as best you can. This is one of the things we did with a product we brought in a few years ago. Essentially put another layer of indirection in between so that if we were to remove that, it wouldn't be a zero impact, but it wouldn't be nearly as big a deal as it would be if we were tightly bound to it. One of the hard things here, though, is realizing when you've pushed this far enough and the decision has been made above you in the hierarchy. And I ran smack dab into this a few years ago, and you just keep running your head into the wall, and you're like, all right, I need to just step back and realize that there's nothing I can do about it. Otherwise, you just drive yourself nuts. There's no getting around that. It's really, really painful. What can help, though, is take a step back and ask yourself, what's the context that this is being brought in? Why are we going in this direction? There may be a really good reason for it. That doesn't mean you agree with that reason, but it helps sometimes to at least understand, oh, this is why they're doing this. This is why they're going in that direction. I can understand the rationale. Now, I'd like to say we as architects get involved in mergers and acquisitions. Honestly, it usually doesn't happen until after the fact. And this is unfortunate because there isn't a single decision that most companies make today that does not have a technology implication. These business decisions don't exist just in the business realm. They don't just exist in the boardroom. I guarantee in today's world there's going to be some kind of a technology impact. You look at the way a lot of companies work, they can pretty much change direction over lunch, go in a whole other direction. They can pivot, as they like to call it. Technology just doesn't adapt that quickly. As best a job as we can do, there's still going to be some turmoil. This came up on a mailing list I'm on. A friend of mine sort of said, hypothetically, it wasn't hypothetical, he knew exactly who he was talking about. Say a big box retailer wanted to open stores in a new country. And he started listing out, just off the top of his head, here are the dozens of issues that crop up in that situation. And this is something where, from the business perspective, this is very easy. We would like to expand into country X. Let's go to country X, buy some land, put up some buildings. How hard could it be? And then there's all sorts of subtlety that comes along with that. Again, we rarely get to take part in those conversations until it's already been announced, and then they look at us and say, make it work. Ideally, we can get in there and do at least kind of a basic sanity check about how this stuff works, but a lot of this is us getting in there, digging into the code bases, digging into the products, and doing what I like to call software archaeology, trying to figure out what's at the base of all this thing. So one of the most important things we can try to figure out right away is, are these stacks compatible in any way, shape, or form? Do we have similar technology in the house? There's a good chance it's something totally different. I think you look at almost any company today, you're going to have a heterogeneous environment. I just don't see that changing. I think it's a little easier now with kind of the microservice push, so maybe it's not as big a deal as it was a few years back. But this is why I always get a kick out of any time I've seen in a company where you've got, say, Java and .NET, and people are like, ooh, we should get rid of one for the other. It's like, really, why? Because even if we got everything over to one stack, whichever one you wanted to win, doesn't really matter, guarantee you're going to buy somebody in the future who uses the opposite stack, and now you're right back where you were. Now, there's very little chance we're going to be able to stop the merger, honestly. But we are going to be tasked with making it work. And so a lot of that boils down to us figuring out what the current state is, figuring out what our desired end state is, and then mapping out a way to get from current to future. So what are we talking about? 20 systems? 1,000 systems? How old are they? What languages are they written in? How many staff do they have supporting it? Can these things run on their own? Do we need to stand up new environment for them? How long can they run on their own? There are certain regulatory requirements where you have to act as one company by this date, so you have to get on one profit and loss sheet. Okay, well, there's a lot of work there. What's that going to look like? How much is it going to cost us to stay standalone if that's what we have to do? One of the other things that gets lost a lot of times in translation is, what about new laws or government regulations that may apply now that you're either a bigger company or maybe you've got a presence in a country you didn't have a presence in before? That gets really, really interesting. You think, well, laws are roughly the same, except they're not. I was talking to a friend of mine who was working with a company trying to expand into Canada, and the laws Canada has about where user data can be stored completely blew up this company's ability to have a single source of customer data, because that's not how it works. All of a sudden, everything in your catalog has to be translated into French, because that's part of Canadian law. Ouch, what are we going to do about that? Who's going to do the translation? So laws are not universally true. Just because that's the way it is in your country does not mean it is in the country you're now in. As architects, we're trying to figure out what are the key patterns here? What kinds of techniques has this company we're merging with or acquiring used in the past? Again, what technologies have they relied on? And what's perfect end state look like? And what is it going to take for us to get there? One of our big jobs is figuring out these transition states. And it's probably multiple, especially if we're talking a big legacy situation. And you look at what happens like when two airlines merge together. I mean, you got this massive legacy code bases on both sides. You try to mush it together and bad things happen. Be very, very careful with these intermediate architectures. It's very tempting to skimp here and say, oh, this will only be in place for a couple of months. There's a pretty good chance it'll be in place for a couple of years. So make sure you plan for that. Anytime I'm involved in one of these transition states, that's one of the very first questions I ask is, what would happen if it had to last twice as long as you're expecting? What's that going to cost us? Is that a total death knell? Politics are a huge, huge part in any merger acquisition. Again, I wish that wasn't part of the job, but it is. I've seen this time and time again. Well, we use X. Insert whatever technology you want here. So we should transition everything to X because X is better. Okay, how much is that going to cost us? Is that really a good thing to do? Is that something that makes sense for the business? Right, so a lot of it is us taking a step back and figuring out, okay, of all the systems we now have, and obviously there's overlap or we wouldn't have done this merger acquisition, what do they do well? What do they do poorly? What kinds of things would we want to retain? Now, unfortunately, in a lot of these conversations, it's not going to be a technical determination. There's going to be some non-technical criteria that become very important, especially as people play the games of politics as they try to protect their fiefdoms. That is the nature of the beast. I've seen this where people say, well, you know what? We have more end users than you do, ergo we should convert all of you to our system, even though that system is 20 years older and uses outdated technology, but it's better because it's cheaper to convert fewer people. And this was really, honestly, all about the politics of it, the fiefdom, the I want to retain my operating budget and not have to give any of it to you. The end of the day, it's on us to tell that story and to understand that a lot of this is outside of our control. We do the best we can. We put as much light on the risks as we can and then just deal with the outcomes of it. If you overthink it, again, it will absolutely drive you nuts. You got to look at the context again and understand that doesn't mean you necessarily agree with it. All right, now, I don't mean to say this is every single kind of review you're ever going to be a part of, but these seem to kind of be the big categories that we run into as architects. Now, in terms of preparing for review, there's sort of two sides of this coin. There's the reviewer, and then, of course, there's the reviewee. So if someone asks you to review their architecture or you get involved in one of these, number one job for you is to actually be prepared. Come to the meeting having actually done your homework. Now, I would hope that that's self-explanatory, but I have been involved in several of these where it was clear people did not do the work beforehand, and now those meetings really are painful as we spend time explaining what was going on instead of actually reading it. Early on in my career, I ran into this. We had this just massive documentation thing we had to do, and you had this big, long meeting you had to go to, and then you had to submit things. I think it was like 2 weeks ahead of the meeting, and you get into the meeting, and you start kind of going through your presentation, and then about 5 minutes in, someone will ask you a question that you literally just stated. You'd say something like, well, we expect to have 10,000 users at peak, and they're like, so how many users are you going to have at peak? Did I not just say 10,000? And you have to kind of scratch your head and say, I'm pretty sure I said that about a minute ago. And my favorite sort of flavor of those meetings is when about 3 or 4 minutes later, someone will then ask the exact same question again because they weren't paying attention the first 2 times you covered the material. It's very, very enjoyable. There's a whole lot of things you want to consider as the reviewer. So the first question is to figure out, well, what the heck are you asking me to review here? Is this kind of an initial sort of stab at what you think you're going to do? Is this you're now telling me what you actually did and this is in production and this is just sort of putting a bow on top of it? Are we reviewing something that we built or are we reviewing something that we bought from someone else? What's the purpose of this review? There's a whole lot of different reasons why we review something. Is this part of sort of a governance review gate, check the box kind of a thing? Is this because we bought another company and they use something and we're looking at, is that fit for purpose for what we have? Did we just go buy some new thing and we need to figure out how it fits into our world, our culture? Or is the project having issues? This is an important reason to do a review as well. If you've got projects that are having massive performance issues or code quality issues, is that why we're looking at this? Are we trying to identify areas where we can make that better? Is this brand new? Is this something we've never done before? Is this maybe in a technology stack we've never used before? What does that look like? Or is this something that's been in production now for 20 years and it's an old legacy thing? Maybe it's something we're sunsetting. That's a really important consideration here too. If you know this product is end of life, if you know we're going to actually shut this down in 6 months, you're going to have a very different sort of concept of whether it's good or bad than if you're like, no, this is the bet the company thing. This is a strategic solution. We're going to be rolling even more work onto this product in the future. So it's very important to understand, is this a strategic thing? Is this a tactical thing? There's a lot of times what we end up having to do, well, we just have to get through the next quarter. We have to get through the next 6 months. So we're going to put a little, baling twine and duct tape and some wire around it and hope it holds. That's one of the most painful aspects of our job. Is this one of several transition states? And hopefully we've clearly identified that, and we've talked about current state and end state. If it is a transition state, again, I guarantee you, one of the things I'm going to ask you is, how long are you expecting to be in that transition state? Are you expecting that to last for 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? As much as we want to think we can just sort of like wave our hands and everything magically gets upgraded or magically gets to the latest version, that's just not how it works. These things take time. How is that all going to work together? You have situations where you need to do some currency work. Let's say the version of your app server is end of life and you need to upgrade it. As much as we want to say just snap your fingers and everybody gets updated, you have to sort of slot that into the work the projects have and understand how that's actually going to fit. Now, part of the challenge there, in fact, I just had this happen to me recently. We had a project team. It's like, well, we can't take the time to do this currency work. It's like, well, what do you mean? we have business deliverables scheduled out through 2018. Now, never mind how, I guess, silly it is to sort of think you've actually got stuff scheduled out for the next 3 years. The idea that this work wasn't optional. This upgrade has to happen. You're on an outdated version for which we no longer have support. You're going to need to figure out how to work that into your business stuff. And that basically means we're going to have a conversation with the business folk to help them understand why that new capability you really wanted is going to have to be delayed by a few months. Now, one of the most important parts of this is understanding if I need to live in this transition state longer than I anticipated, what does that mean? How much is that going to cost us? Because there's situations where well, we'll just keep that server running. I remember when the whole Windows XP thing finally died, I was talking to somebody about, because they were actually trying to stay on Windows XP, and they'd actually talked to Microsoft about what it would cost to, get support essentially. And I think the number was something like 20,000 US per instance per quarter. And so there's this massive sum of money, and that's what it finally took for people to go, oh, okay, we really can't afford that. We need to get off of it. And so it's like now the scale has finally tipped where it's cheaper to do the upgrade than it is to pay the vendor this outlandish support cost. Another really important thing to look at as a reviewer is, does this make sense? Do you understand it? Because, I've seen a lot of architectural diagrams that were purely shock and awe. You were not intended to actually understand it. It was just the architect saying, look at how brilliant I am. I created a whole bunch of boxes. What does it prove? What does it show? You should be able to get it. It might take you, a couple of hours, but you should be able to understand it. Because if you can't, we got a problem. Because if you as a peer architect cannot understand the architecture, how the heck can we assume a team is going to figure it out? Now, another important part of this is once you've understood it, is it actually appropriate? Are we trying to stand up an enterprise-wide solution on a little itty-bitty box that doesn't have enough capacity for it? By the same token, are we taking something that's going to be used by 3 or 4 people, but we're putting it on enough infrastructure to handle 100 million customers shopping at peak pre-Christmas Black Friday sales? You have to understand that, and that's one of the things that gets really challenging, because a lot of times we make some grandiose statements about where we're going to be. Of course we're going to have hundreds of thousands of users. Of course we're going to have thousands of concurrent requests. Really? You sure about that? And what some people think of as big scale, when you actually look at it compared to things that really are working at big scale, is radically different. Are there any other things we should be considering here? Other solutions? Other avenues? Other architectures, perhaps? Is there some other way we could construct this? Push comes to shove, our job as a reviewer, it all boils down to this. Did you do a good job telling the story? Is this coherent? Does it make sense? Do I get it? Can I now, leveraging this, explain it to somebody else? And if, as a reviewer, I'm not comfortable with that, if I don't think you've done a good enough job telling the story, it's on me then to help you tell that story better. It isn't enough for me just to say, well, this isn't very good. I should be giving you concrete, constructive ways of improving it. Perhaps it's adding a little bit of prose here, perhaps it's adding another diagram, whatever it happens to be, but that's my job then, is to help you see those gaps and then help you close them. Now, the flip side of it is you are reviewing my thing, and this is challenging too, and one of the hardest parts of this is understanding that I'm not being attacked here. I have to put on some thicker skin and realize that, yes, this is about my architecture, not about me. I'm just trying to get better at my craft. One of the things that I look at as the reviewee, did I get all the stakeholders right? Did I miss someone important here? Is there another application that we need to talk with? If so, what does that look like? Is there some other group that's interested in this solution, and I, again, need to make sure I'm talking with those folks? Looking at my reviewers, now hopefully they've asked a whole bunch of questions before we even get to the meeting. Have I gone through and provided adequate answers to all those, or did I just sort of blow it off? Looking at their questions usually is going to find a pattern for me where I can say, I clearly need to add a little more to the story here. There's clearly something they didn't get based on how I presented it, so I'm going to need to tweak that in some way, shape, or form. So again, do I need to add another diagram? Is there something else I need to do in pictures? Is there some more things I need to write down? I think a lot of times we reach for a model when in reality, a couple paragraphs of text is actually better. It's a balancing act. I mean, there are absolutely times where one or two images are perfect. And there are other times where, you know what, I really just need to write this out. That's the easiest, most simple way to do it. Now, I very much believe my first job actually is to have one of my peers look at it. So before I submit this to a wider ranging review, have a trusted friend, someone on your team say, can you just give this a glance, see what you think, let me know if there's other stuff I should put in here. And part of it is just getting them to say, are we actually ready for this? One of the very first reviews I ever was part of as the reviewee, one of my peers was like, well, it's missing this diagram. Are you sure we're even ready to do this? And of course, from my standpoint, that diagram wasn't useful. But that was because I was in the weeds of the project. I knew what was going on. He didn't. And so that diagram helped him understand the purpose of the project. It's like, gotcha. Okay, so now I understand why for him that was a critical thing and for me it wasn't. Do we have a lot of things that are still in churn? Maybe now's not the best time to have the review. Maybe we want to wait another month or two until things kind of settle down. I'm a big, big believer in having someone on your team look at it before you go in for a wider review. Let's get another set of eyes on it and then go ahead and kick it off for the more formal process. If you can't do that, just set it down for a couple days. You've all had that reviewing experience where you're reading something and your mind just inserts the missing words, or it fixes the typos for you, and it's only when you've looked at it a couple days later like, oh God, I totally missed this and that. Right? Come back to it a couple days later and give it a fresh set of eyes and say, okay, what do I think about it now? Is it still what I expect to see here? Is it clear? Do I get to my points quickly? Is it concise? I'm very much of the opinion too many of these architecture documents, they're heavy, there's too much stuff in it. It's all about trying to impress other people as opposed to actually trying to tell the story. So I'm very much of the opinion that every single line, every single diagram has to prove its existence. If it's not adding to the story, get rid of it. Just get rid of it. I'd rather see the document slimmed down, even though it doesn't have a, quote unquote required diagram in it, but it tells the story and it tells it effectively, as opposed to, well, we always put that diagram in, so I added it anyway. This is one of the big moves we made a couple years ago. We took like our standard template and pretty much gutted it, because there's a whole bunch of sections in there that just didn't apply anymore. The template had been created, 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. And so there was like a use case diagram section in there. And at one point, I sort of poked at one of the architects. I'm like, why do we even do this? Most of our projects are agile today. They don't have, traditional use cases anymore. And let's be honest, as a reviewing architect, I can't tell you whether your use cases are right or wrong. It's like the object model. I've seen that included in some of these documents. Unless you do something really silly, like apple descends from whale, I can't tell you your object model is right or wrong. Many, many years ago, I was a tech lead on a project, and I put together this object model, and I was very proud of myself because there was only like one crossing line, and it was lots and lots of things, and I proudly showed it to one of our architects, and he kind of looked at me and was like, yeah, what do you want me to do with this? And I was a little crestfallen because I'm like, but I put so much time into this. Did you not notice there's only one crossing line? And now that I'm on the other side of that coin, I totally get it. He wasn't involved day to day to be able to say, yes, this is the right way to model your domain. And as a reviewer, I'm not either. So don't show me something that's not going to help me review your architecture. One of the hardest jobs as the reviewee is not taking it personally. This is hard. There's no getting around it. You just have to repeat this mantra to yourself. It's not about me, it's about the architecture. It's not about me, it's about the architecture. We're just trying to get to a better architecture. So one of the ways we look at this, and this is basically our process, we look at projects early on and basically kind of figure out how big is this? And that really boils down to a few different categories. Cost is obviously a part of this. We look at a $10 million project very differently than a $10,000 project. But complexity fits into that too. If it's a really complex, lots of moving parts, even if it doesn't cost that much, we're going to give it more attention than we would otherwise. And then of course, risk is a big part of that. And risk is both technical and business risk. What happens if this project fails? Do we go out of business? Does that cost us millions and millions of dollars in revenue? So very, very early on in a project, when we're still kind of kicking the tires on it, we want to get an idea of where it fits in that bucket. How much architectural attention does this project deserve? Big thing we're trying to do at that stage is just figure out what the risks are, what could go wrong. Let's make sure those have been discussed and that that has been reflected up where necessary. At this stage, we want a summary of the project. We want to be able to figure out what the heck are we doing, why are we doing it, so people have the context. Are we sunsetting something? Is this a brand new product? Is this maintenance? Is this a currency update? What's going on here? Now, the way our process works, we actually ask the presenting architect a set of questions. There's actually a form that they fill out as they do this. Are you following all our standards and best practices? Now, this, of course, relies on our presenting architects actually knowing what the best practices and the standards are. This is also one of the things that we get educationally from doing the review, is people can say, by the way, you know, you're not following this standard, and they're like, oh, I didn't know about that one. Great, now you do. Are we following any enterprise standards that apply? Do you know all the stakeholders? Do you know everybody that's interested in the outcome of this project? If you can't find any, you're doing something wrong. There's got to be at least somebody who cares. Does this match up to our roadmaps? So if we know there's certain vendor products that are coming or certain upgrades that are coming, are you aligned with that or not? If not, what do we need to do to get you aligned to that? And can we put you either in the early availability or sort of add something in your project so you know you've got to take care of that? Is this a strategic thing? Not all of our stuff is strategic. Some things are tactical. Some things are just, let's keep it running for another 6 months until that business runs off or whatever it happens to be. Are there other projects that depend on yours? Now, this is a hard one. We've had a lot of debate about how to talk about this. So let's say you've got a project and everything's going great, but it depends on this other project where things aren't going so great. Now, we've already shed light on the fact that, these projects are related and this one's going well and that one's not, but do you mark the one that's going well as not going so well because it depends on a project that's not going so well? So is that yellow sort of transitive or not? I don't know. Believe me, we've had hours of debate on that one. So at least identify them, make sure we know what they are. Are we using all the strategic tools, frameworks, et cetera, that we have, and are we up to date? This has taken on a great deal of importance in our organization, especially because the whole Windows XP thing was a very expensive upgrade and exposed an awful lot of areas where we were behind. Right, so let's make sure we're on the latest and greatest wherever humanly possible. If we've already got an existing widget or component that does that, are we using it? Or did you invent your own yet again? If so, bad developer, try again. Do we need special infrastructure for it? Is there something else we need to spin up? Or does this fit in our existing model or not? We started to take a lot of look at data. What kinds of data does the project have? Is it personally identifiable? Do we have credit card information? How do we need to treat that data? And where does that data go? Is it strictly internal? Does it ever leave the firewall? If so, we're going to have some different opinions about it. We're going to look at it in a more stringent way. All of those questions feed into a color. I mentioned this yesterday, but I think there's like a certain level of management where the only thing you're allowed to think in is in terms of red, yellow, green. That's it. You're not allowed to get any deeper. So push comes to shove, these questions will generate an answer. Either the project is in good shape, could be better, or stop the presses, something really bad is going on here. Now, we do override those colors occasionally. So I've actually been involved in projects where my project was green, but we marked it as yellow to get additional attention on it. So we wanted to sort of raise it up so that the senior leadership were aware there is an issue here. Again, this is something we're struggling with, is what's the best way to sort of deliver that message to senior leadership? Now, I'm a big believer in having some kind of an architectural document that people can feed into. Ideally, this is something that's essentially like a form you kind of fill out as you go along as an architect. It should be an additive thing. I've seen situations where we have, I guess they call them chapters or something like that, and you basically repeated the same information 4 or 5 times. It's like, why am I copying and pasting from this section into this new section? It's called the same thing. You've already got that information there, so why don't we just add the new section to the existing document instead of copying it from one document to another? It should be a pretty straightforward thing, though. You can argue about what all needs to be included in here. My opinion, have an overview. And this is, again, that sanity check. What's the project about? This shouldn't be a novel. This should be a few paragraphs, maybe a couple pages, depending how big the project is. Make sure we're talking about assumptions. This is a big deal. This is something we've had a lot of discussion on. What's the best way to document assumptions and architectural decisions? But let's get that stuff identified. Let's have a spot for risks. What are the risks to the project? So we make sure that we're talking about that right away. Are there any constraints on the solution or on what we're trying to do? Get the stakeholders in there. Who's really interested in this project and what are they concerned about? If you've got a lot of proprietary data that's maybe going outside the firewall, guess what? Security guys are going to be a major stakeholder there. They're going to have some opinions and some directives on the things you're going to have to do. We look a lot at capacity. If you're planning on having millions of users of the system, can you grow up to that or not? And if not, what do we need to do to make that work for you? And then there's usually going to be some set of diagrams. And this is what a lot of people, I think, traditionally consider, architectural stuff. I've seen situations where people ask for a lot of diagrams that, quite frankly, aren't useful. I mentioned the use case before. I also mentioned the object models. Yeah, I guess if it helps you sort of understand the solution, that's great, but I just don't know that it does a whole lot for the architectural document itself. I'm very much of the opinion you should have a very, very small set of required documents. Maybe 3 or 4, you can sort of quibble around the edges. Now, some of that depends on where we are in the project lifecycle, a brand new project versus a legacy project. The way we try to sort of pare this down, we've got a pretty small set of required diagrams these days. Context, this is just a real high level, from a black box perspective, what does the system do? Who does the system interact with? And that's not terribly detailed, gives you a very, 3,000 meter view of what's going on with the project. Get down a little lower, components. What are the main key components of this system? You can almost think about that these days as like, what are the microservices that make up the system? Conceptual data models can be really interesting. Now, this gets into more of like the information architecture domain. That's not where I live, but there can be some good discussions around, well, what sorts of data are you capturing? How are you capturing it? Now, in general, I don't know that that's terribly useful, but I was actually involved in a review where I looked at their schema and they were putting an XML blob into the schema, and I started asking why, and it turns out they didn't have a good reason. And so we actually, I think, helped the project quite a bit by saying, no, that blob needs to actually be a new table for you guys. You can't just jam it in there and then have to parse it every single freaking time you pull it out of the database. Deployment diagrams, these can be very useful, especially as we go more and more to the cloud. What does it look like and what kind of things do we need to stand up to make this thing work? Sequence diagrams can be helpful. I don't think you need to diagram every single interaction. 1 or 2 sort of high-level architecturally significant sequence diagrams is probably more than sufficient. Just sort of depends. And this is one where I've pushed back a little bit and failed. I lost this one. But this should not be every single interaction. You're just going to go blind trying to do that, and it's not useful to the reviewers. Some other data models can be helpful. Physical data model might be useful. Logical data model might be useful. This is debatable in my mind, but some of our info architects really, really like to have that there, so that's fine if they want to play there. As far as I'm concerned, anything else is basically optional. That doesn't mean you shouldn't include it. Again, what this all boils down to is, what do I need to do to tell the story? If adding in another diagram, adding in another couple paragraphs of text helps, by all means do it. A lot of our projects have security touch points because we have some interesting interaction with security or something we maybe haven't done before. And so having that in there can be really useful to everybody to understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, how do we pass identity from this service to that service, that kind of stuff. Disaster recovery can be a really good thing to do as well. We had one project recently where they have a requirement to be hot in both data centers. And so if one goes down, there can be no fail. I mean, it's automatically got to bounce up in the other place. And so they actually had to build some custom stuff to make that happen. And we've worked with our vendors trying to figure out, is there a better way to do this? And they're kind of like, nope. That's a little scary, honestly, but that's part of the deal, is us identifying that for that particular project, disaster recovery is a really, really big deal. So again, whatever helps tell the story is what we should include. If you need another diagram, add another diagram, but make sure it's there for a good reason and not just to fill a space in your template. Now, once you're done, and I put done in quotes because let's be honest, we're never really done with any of this stuff, but once you reach a point where you're ready to have it reviewed, we work with a coordinator. So we've got a guy in our team, that's his job, is basically to coordinate these reviews along with some other stuff. And so you work with that guy to figure out, who do you want reviewing it? So it's not going to be everybody. There's going to be a small subset of folks. Generally, it's 2 or 3, maybe 4 people, depending on how big it is. And now which folks from my team get assigned, it just depends on the project. And it depends on what it is we're reviewing, what kind of expertise do we want to bring to bear. So since I'm kind of the front-end mobile guy, if there's anything in that space, I'm going to get it. There's just no getting around it. That's going to end up in my bucket. If there's a security constraint, I've got one of my peers absolutely is going to be involved in that because he's essentially our security domain guy. So whatever domain sort of is most important, inevitably is going to be included, others as well as needed. Now, I'm of the opinion you should give folks at least a couple of weeks to do the review. 1 week to me is probably like the minimum time frame because most people are pretty busy. They can't generally just sort of drop everything and dive into it and do a good job. They might be able to skim it, but I'd really rather they take their time and do it well. Now, usually these meetings, you can get everything done in about half an hour. I like the idea of keeping it short. If you give yourself 2 hours, you will find a way to spend 2 hours on it. And it probably won't be as useful as if you're more focused and constrained. Big belief in trying to keep it short and make people focus and get things done. Now, the way it works in our world, if you get one of these meeting invites and you accept it, you are now accountable as a reviewer. It is your job to review it. If you do not review it, that is not a good thing. That will come up on your review. As a reviewer, my job is then to pose questions to the presenting architect. So I pour through the documents, asking questions as I go along. We've got actually a form we fill out as we do this, and that ends up sending it to that architect. That person then goes ahead and responds. And sometimes we actually have a back and forth in the system if that's what we need to do. But once we get to the actual meeting, hopefully the presenting architects had an opportunity to answer all those questions. And then it's really just a matter of us going through it as a group and saying, are we comfortable with this? Do we think the questions have been adequately answered? Is there anything else that has come up in the meantime? And ultimately, are the reviewers happy? Do they think this is in a good shape, or do they agree with the architectural decisions that have been made? Now, there's always a lot of discussion here, and there should be. That's the whole point of this. So what I'm hoping happens in these meetings is the reviewing architects are asking things like, hey, did you think about doing it this way, or did you think about this product? What happens if this unfortunate thing occurs? At the end of that whole process, we end up with a red, yellow, green score. If it's green, everybody's happy, thumbs up, out the door we go. If it's yellow or red, this is where things get kicked up a notch, and we have the senior architects take a look at it. This is kind of an awareness thing more than anything else, and they may debate it themselves, or they may sort of push it down to the lower tier, whatever they feel like doing. But what we're trying to do there is understand, why is it green, or why isn't it green, and what do we need to do to get it to green? So that whole path to green becomes a really big part of that conversation. And sometimes what it boils down to is there is something here that we can't control. We need that to be identified. We need our senior leadership folks to be aware of it so that if something bad happens, they understand we did everything we could possibly do here. We just had some stuff we couldn't change. If there's anything we need to escalate, get it escalated, get the right people involved. At the end of the day, this is really an awareness thing. What we don't want to have happen is 2 months later, something bad happens on the project, and they start pointing fingers at architecture, and everyone's like, wait, how come we didn't know about this? Now, I want to point out, this is not a static thing by any stretch of the imagination. This can and should be changed regularly. It should be viewed as a work in progress. You should be able to go back to it and ask yourself, hey, what do we like about this process? What don't we like about it? What can we change? We've done an awful lot of refining of sort of the diagrams that we use, the documentation we put together, how we put it together, and we keep doing that on a regular basis. Now, there's some other things that you want to think about as you do this. Do you want to formalize how you define quality attributes, how you get those documented? It's a very important part of our job is identifying them, make sure they actually matter. There's some things people always throw out there, ooh, scalability. It's like, well, are you sure about that? You've only got 50 users. We probably don't need to worry about scaling up to 50 million. Architectural decisions, they happen. It's part of being an architect. But how we document them is interesting. You've all been on a project at some point. You hit the fork in the road. You're like, do we go right? Do we go left? And you have a long, drawn-out conversation about it, and you decide to go right. And then 2 months later, you're like, oh, shoot, why do we go right? Now we run into some other wall, and it's only because you went right, and then you forget what the heck, and you made a good decision. So get that documented in some meaningful way for you so you don't have this wonderful, quarterbacking that happens, like, ooh, you guys made a bad decision. And it helps you, too, as a project, you progress, and you're like, I know we had a good reason for doing this. Does anybody remember what it was? Well, of course, because we documented it right here. You're probably going to want some kind of a class or mentoring way of getting people through this. Walk through the stuff people are expected to create. This is something we did recently. We built a modeling class so folks know what it is they're expected to create. We don't dictate specific tools for any of this. We've got a big enough organization that if we tried to say, thou shalt all use insert tool here, there would be revolt. not worth it. If you're comfortable with Visio, use Visio. If you'd rather use some UML tool, that's great. Some projects decide for all of our stuff, it's all going to be in this tool. That's fine. We don't want to mess with that. Whatever works matters. Now, one of the things that we try to do with this is sort of figure out how many projects do we actually have that are red, yellow, and green. And obviously, we expect most of them to be green, but there's probably going to be a few that are either red or yellow. And so for those, we want to make sure we understand what is the path to get to green, and then follow up to make sure that that's actually happening. Again, guys, the end of the day, this all boils down to a really simple thing. We got to tell the story. How good a job did we do at telling that story? What could we do to tell it better? Now, the only way we're going to get better at this is by reviewing it, by having other eyes on it. I can't get better in a vacuum. All right, so having good, effective reviews is a vital way of improving. It's a healthy practice to do. You need to be prepared for it. You need to be professional in these meetings and use it as an opportunity to learn from one another. Use it as an opportunity to get better, because we can all improve in this area. I just want to say good luck, and thank you all for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and have a great afternoon.